I didn't think the worst day of my life would start so quietly. I didn't know it yet, but the person about to destroy my reputation wasn't my wife. It was the son I raised. If you're still here, stay with me to the end, because what happened next turned my divorce hearing into something that felt less like a courtroom and more like a revenge story I never asked to be part of. The courthouse was already warm for an October morning. That stale mix of old wood, paper, and disinfectant clung to the air. The kind of smell you don't forget once it gets in your nose. I sat on a hard bench, hands folded the way men do when they're trying not to shake. 67 years old, married for over 2 decades, and reduced to waiting for strangers to decide what was left of my life. I thought I knew what pain was. Losing my wife felt heavy enough. I was wrong. The judge hadn't even finished reviewing the paperwork when someone stood up behind me. I assumed it was a lawyer, maybe a clerk. I didn't turn around at first. Then, I heard my son's voice. "Your Honor, may I say something?" Lucas, 22. The kid I raised. The kid whose scraped knees I cleaned, whose tuition I paid, whose first car I co-signed for when the bank laughed at him. The judge nodded. Lucas walked forward. Not rushed, not nervous. That's what struck me first. He wasn't shaking. He wasn't angry. He looked prepared, like this moment had been rehearsed in his head more than once. He stopped in front of me and held out a plain white envelope. "Dad," he said, clearly enough for the whole room to hear. "You should read this." I remember thinking it was a letter, maybe something emotional, maybe something cruel but private. I took it anyway, because I still believed in the rules of being a father. You take what your child hands you. Inside was a single sheet of paper. 5 words. "Dad, I'm not your son." For a second, I honestly thought I'd misread it. I blinked, read it again. Same words, same neat handwriting I'd praised all through grade school. The room didn't react right away. No gasps, no murmurs, just silence, thick and heavy, like everyone was waiting to see if I'd fall apart or stand up swinging. My ears rang, my chest went tight. Not the kind of pain you clutch at, but the kind that makes your body go numb before your mind can catch up. I looked at Lucas. He didn't look away. That was the moment something broke in me. Not loudly, not dramatically. Quietly. Permanently. The judge cleared her throat. "Mr. Lucas, what exactly are you claiming?" Lucas didn't hesitate. "I'm saying the man sitting there is not my biological father." A few heads turned. Someone behind us shifted in their seat. I felt eyes on the back of my neck, on my shoulders, on the years I'd spent being someone's dad without ever being asked to prove it. I wanted to ask 100 questions. I asked none. The judge asked the one that mattered. "And when did you discover this?" Lucas glanced at me, just briefly, then looked back at her. "Years ago," he said. That word hit harder than the letter. Years. Not yesterday, not last week. Years. While I was paying bills. While I was covering tuition. While I was wiring money when he called and said he was short again. Lucas continued, calm as ever. I waited until today because today it finally mattered. That's when I understood something that took me decades to learn. This wasn't about blood. This was about erasing me. I didn't react the way people probably expected me to. I didn't shout. I didn't stand up. I didn't even ask Lucas what he meant. I just sat there, holding that envelope, while one thought kept circling in my head like it was looking for somewhere to land. Maybe this is my fault. That's the part no one talks about when a man gets accused, especially a man my age. We don't immediately get angry. We rewind our lives instead. We start auditing every decision, every missed dinner, every late night we told ourselves was for the family. As the judge called for a brief pause, my mind drifted backward without my permission. I remembered Lucas at 8 years old, sitting at the kitchen table while I helped him with math homework after a 12-hour shift. I was tired, impatient sometimes, but I stayed. I remembered coaching his Little League team even when my knees started to ache. I remembered signing the papers for his first car because his credit didn't exist yet and mine did. I remembered the phone call sophomore year of college. "Dad, I messed up. I'm short on rent." I didn't ask how. I just wired the money. And sitting there in that courtroom, I started asking myself the question men like me always ask when things fall apart. Was I there enough? I worked hard. Too hard, maybe. 60-hour weeks weren't unusual, sometimes more. I told myself it was temporary, that one day I'd slow down, that providing was the same thing as loving. Maybe Lucas didn't see it that way. Maybe all he remembered were the empty chairs at a few school events. Maybe all he felt was absence, not effort. That thought hurt more than the envelope ever could. I looked at him again. He wouldn't meet my eyes. And instead of anger, I felt something heavier. Shame. Not because of what he'd said, but because part of me wondered if he was right to say it. There's a moment like that where a man starts shrinking inside himself. You don't notice it from the outside, but inside, you start rewriting your own story with yourself as the villain. I thought about something Lucas used to say when he was younger. He said it often, especially after I paid for something big. Tuition, books, repairs. "Don't worry, Dad," he'd say. "I'll pay you back someday." At the time, I laughed it off. I told him that wasn't how family worked. But sitting there, holding that envelope, the memory felt different. He hadn't said it with gratitude. He'd said it like a promise, like a ledger entry. If you're listening to this and you're a father, or maybe a grandfather, let me ask you something, honestly. Have you ever looked back at your life and wondered if everything you gave was ever really seen? Or if it was just expected? The courtroom noise faded back in as the judge returned. Papers shuffled. Someone coughed. Life moved forward while I was still stuck in my head, questioning a lifetime of choices. Lucas finally spoke again, his voice calm, controlled. "I'm not trying to hurt anyone," he said. "I just want what's fair." Fair. That word landed wrong. Because fairness is something you argue about when strangers owe each other money. Not when a man spends decades believing he's building a family. And that's when it hit me, quietly but clearly. This wasn't just about blood. This was about whether everything I'd done counted for anything at all. The judge leaned forward slightly, the way people do when they think they already know the answer, but still need to hear it out loud. "Mr. Lucas," she said, "when did you discover that Mr. Raymond was not your biological father?" Lucas didn't look at me. He didn't look at his mother either. He looked straight ahead, calm, almost bored, like this was a formality he'd already rehearsed. "Years ago," he said. "Not recently, not after some argument, not during the divorce. Years." That word landed heavier than the envelope ever had. It sank straight into my chest and stayed there. The judge paused. "How many years?" Lucas shrugged slightly. "Long enough." I felt my hands tighten together in my lap. Long enough to what? To think? To grieve? To be confused? No. Long enough to decide. Images started lining up in my head without asking permission. The tuition checks. The rent I wired when he called at midnight. The time I refinanced the house so he wouldn't have to drop out of school. All those moments suddenly rearranged themselves into something uglier. He knew. All that time, he knew. The judge asked the question I couldn't bring myself to ask. Why bring this up now? Lucas finally glanced at me then. Just a quick look. No anger, no sadness, just calculation. Because today it finally mattered, he said. There it was. Not a confession, not an apology. A strategy. Today mattered because money mattered, because custody mattered, because credibility mattered, because erasing me today had value. I felt something inside me go very still. This wasn't a young man processing a painful truth. This was someone who had weighed silence against advantage and chosen his timing carefully. He hadn't been confused all those years. He'd been patient. My lawyer shifted beside me, but I barely noticed. All I could hear was Lucas's voice echoing back through the years, saying things that now sounded different. Don't worry, Dad. I'll pay you back someday. I used to smile when he said that. I thought it meant pride, responsibility. Now I heard something else in it. Accounting. The judge frowned. You continued to accept financial support from Mr. Raymond after learning this information? Lucas nodded. Yes. And you never told him? No. Why? Lucas's answer was quiet. Because it didn't change anything back then. Back then I was useful. That realization hurt in a way I didn't have words for. It wasn't rage. It wasn't heartbreak. It was the slow understanding that I hadn't been a father in his eyes for a long time. Just a role that came with benefits. I felt embarrassed for all the wrong reasons. Not because I'd been fooled, but because I'd believed gratitude was automatic. Because I thought years of showing up, even imperfectly, created some kind of bond that couldn't be erased by convenience. Lucas sat back down like he'd just finished explaining a scheduling conflict. The courtroom was quiet again, but it wasn't the same silence as before. This one felt sharper. People weren't wondering if something bad had happened anymore. They were realizing what kind of bad it was. I didn't look at Lucas again. I didn't need to. In that moment, I understood something that took me nearly 7 decades to learn. Being someone's father isn't what hurts when it's taken away. What hurts is realizing that the years you gave were never seen as a gift, only as a balance waiting to be cleared. I used to believe money was the least emotional thing in a family. I was wrong. My lawyer stood and asked permission to approach the bench. The judge nodded, already looking tired, like she'd seen this kind of family math before. Just not this cold. Your Honor, my lawyer said, we'd like to submit a summary of recent financial activity. That was when Lucas finally shifted in his seat. Not panic, not fear, just irritation. Like a man who thought the numbers were settled and didn't appreciate being double-checked. Screens lit up. Bank statements, transfer log, dates and amounts lined up neatly. The way truth often does when it doesn't need to raise its voice. There were multiple transfers from a joint account, my lawyer continued, made over the last 5 months. The judge adjusted her glasses. Transfers to whom? To an account controlled by Mr. Lucas. I felt the room tighten. The amounts weren't massive on their own. A few thousand here, a few thousand there. But together, they told a story I hadn't known I was part of. The judge pointed at the screen. What were these payments for? Lucas answered before his attorney could. Reimbursement. The word echoed. Reimbursement. Like I'd been a vendor. Like 20 years of parenting came with receipts. The judge raised an eyebrow. Reimbursement for what, exactly? Lucas hesitated for half a second, just enough to tell on himself. For expenses he covered that weren't his responsibility. That's when it hit me. Not all at once. Slowly. Clearly. Every tuition check. Every emergency wire. Every quiet bailout I never mentioned to anyone else. He'd been keeping score. I remembered the notes on those transfers. I hadn't noticed them at the time. Who checks the memo line when you trust your own family? But there they were now, enlarged on a courtroom screen. Back pay. Reimbursement. Not thank you. Not dad. Just accounting. The judge looked back at Lucas. So you accepted financial support from Mr. Raymond for years, knowing he believed he was your father, and later categorized those funds as debts owed to you. Lucas shrugged. I was just organizing things. Organizing things. A strange thing happened then. Something small, almost nothing. A child from another family case, sitting 2 rows back, leaned toward her mother and whispered, not trying to be funny, not trying to be cruel, just confused. If he wasn't his dad, she said softly, then why did he pay for everything? It wasn't loud. No one laughed. But Lucas froze, just for a moment. Long enough for the truth to land without anyone saying another word. The judge cleared her throat, and the room moved on. But that question hung there, heavier than any accusation. I sat still, staring at my hands. This wasn't theft in the legal sense. It was worse than that. It was the quiet rewriting of history, turning sacrifice into obligation. Turning care into a bill that came due the moment gratitude stopped being useful. I realized then that Lucas hadn't rejected me out of anger or confusion. He'd done it because gratitude doesn't fit neatly into spreadsheets. And in that moment, I understood exactly where I stood in his life. Not as a father, as a balance waiting to be cleared. The judge leaned back in her chair and folded her hands, the way someone does when the facts are no longer confusing, but the people are. Mr. Lucas, she said evenly, before we go any further, I need to ask you something directly. Lucas straightened, confident again. He'd recovered from that brief moment earlier. The numbers were on his side, or so he believed. Do you feel any sense of obligation or gratitude toward Mr. Raymond for raising you? The judge asked. Regardless of biology, the question landed in the room like a held breath. For the first time that morning, I looked at Lucas again. Not as his father, not even as the man who'd paid his way. I looked at him as a stranger whose answer could finally free me, or finish me. Lucas didn't hesitate. That's not how money works, he said. No anger, no sarcasm, just certainty. A few people shifted in their seats. Someone exhaled sharply. My lawyer lowered his pen. That sentence did something to me. It didn't break me. It clarified everything. In that moment, I understood there was nothing left to explain. No memory I could bring up. No sacrifice I could point to. No night I stayed up worrying that would suddenly matter. You can't argue with someone who's already reduced you to a number. The judge studied him for a long second, then turned her gaze toward me. Mr. Raymond, she said, not unkindly, do you wish to respond? For a brief moment, I considered standing there and listing everything I'd done. The years, the work, the money, the missed sleep, the quiet pride. Then I realized that would only prove his point. So I stood up slowly, feeling every one of my 67 years in my knees, and said the only thing that was true and necessary. I never asked him to love me, I said. I just never thought he'd erase me. That was it. No speech, no defense, no plea. I sat back down. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was final. Lucas looked at me then. Really looked at me, like he was trying to decide whether I'd just lost or finally stopped playing. His expression didn't change. The judge removed her glasses and set them on the bench. "This court does not exist to reward strategic cruelty," she said calmly. "Nor does it recognize moral debts selectively enforced for financial advantage." Lucas's attorney shifted, preparing to speak, but the judge raised a hand. "I've heard enough." I felt something loosen in my chest. Not relief exactly, but release. For years, I'd been carrying the quiet hope that one day Lucas would understand what I'd done for him. That he'd see it not as obligation, but as care, as choice. That hope slipped away right then. And strangely, I felt lighter without it. Because when someone tells you, clearly, publicly, and without shame, that they never saw your sacrifice as love, you're finally allowed to stop proving it. I didn't walk out of that courtroom victorious, but I walked out no longer begging to be acknowledged. And for the first time since the envelope touched my hands, that felt like enough. The ruling didn't come with drama. No gavel slammed, no raised voices. Just calm words delivered in a tone that told everyone in the room this part was already decided. The judge ordered the questionable transfers frozen pending review. She dismissed the financial claims, built on what she called selective truth. Lucas was instructed to return any remaining funds to the joint account while the court sorted out what could and couldn't be justified. He didn't argue. He just nodded once, like a man accepting a delayed flight. When court adjourned, people stood, papers shuffled, lives resumed. Lucas gathered his things without looking at me. Not a goodbye, not even a glance. He walked past like I was an old piece of furniture, something that had served its purpose. I stayed seated for a moment after everyone else cleared out. At 67, you learn the difference between winning and surviving. I hadn't won anything that day, but I'd stopped bleeding. 6 months later, my life looked smaller, and somehow clearer. The house was quieter, not lonely, just quiet. I sold things I didn't need anymore. Simplified accounts. Closed the ledger I'd been keeping in my head for decades, tallying effort against appreciation. I stopped asking myself whether I'd been enough. Because here's the truth no one tells men like us. Some people don't reject you because you failed them. They reject you because gratitude doesn't benefit them anymore. Lucas moved on quickly. I heard it through a mutual acquaintance. New job, new apartment, clean slate. No mention of me. I wasn't angry about that. I'd finally learned the cost of expecting acknowledgement from someone who never intended to give it. What surprised me most was how much energy I suddenly had. Without the need to explain myself. Without the quiet hope that one day he'd say, "You did right by me." I started doing things for myself. Mornings with real coffee instead of rushing out the door. Walks that weren't just to clear my head before another obligation. I even laughed once, out loud, at how long I'd mistaken responsibility for love. The last letter I received from the court came in a plain envelope. It confirmed what I already knew. Financial matters resolved. No further contact required. I folded it neatly and placed it in a drawer I rarely open. Some chapters don't need to be reread. I don't know if Lucas will ever regret what he did. That's not my burden anymore. Regret belongs to people who recognize loss. What I do know is this: being erased by someone you raised hurts in a way nothing else quite does. But staying erased, on your own terms, is where dignity begins. If you're listening to this and you've ever given years of your life to someone who later treated it like a transaction, I want to ask you something before we part. At what point did you stop asking to be seen? And if you haven't yet, what would your life look like if you did?